Well, welcome to the first of the big ideas in little pictures. Remember, what we said we'd do is look at one of the big theological concepts that David identified in Gregory of Nyssa, particularly his doctrine of creation ex nihilo. The first one is abduction or imagination, whereby we are going to look at a big theological idea, compare it, however, to a very human way of thinking and give sketches and stories to illustrate that. So idea number one is that God creates the end before the beginning. So this could well be the most intriguing concept that David expressed in his readings of Gregory. That is the idea that God created not from the beginning, but from the end. Here's what David actually said. From the perspective of eternity, the end comes first and the beginning comes last. True creation is true humanity in the divine image, perfected in divine likeness and union with God. This is the man, quote, of the first creation account, Genesis 1:27. This is all human beings throughout all time united in spiritual harmony in their rational nature with Christ as their head, deified in God. And this is the true creation. Until that reality comes to pass, creation has not yet happened in a sense. From eternity, that is the creation that God has made to be. In time, or from time, it is the end of our temporal course, but in eternity, it is the very foundation of our existence. End of quote. Now, this quote peers into the mind of God as he creates, and it speculates about the mentality of the divine. This is daring, of course, but it's important, I would argue, because as Gregory is attempting to look at creation from the Creator's perspective, as the initiator of all existence, he is not trying to look at creation from our perspective inside the created order. The value of doing this is that we will stretch our thinking into the knowledge of God and begin to understand him more. But the challenge is that this thinking is eternal and divine. So that makes it counterintuitive and hard to grasp and hard to describe. We humans tend to think in terms of time and sequences, which leads us, that's how we frame reality, and that leads us to what I would call the problem-solving view of salvation. So let me sketch what I mean by that problem-solving view of salvation. It would say, well, we begin with Genesis 1 and 2 in the scripture, which is the epic story of creation, the Judeo-Christian story of creation. Then, however, comes the fall in Genesis 3, and the fall initiates an unraveling, which begins in Genesis 4 but continues throughout the Old Testament, Kings, Judges, Samuel, whatever, which I like calling the Great Unraveling. As we see the consequences of human sin in activities and in brokenness. This unraveling continues throughout history until the incarnation. And in the incarnation, we climax with the cross. And the cross is, as it were, the solution. It is the great salvation or redemption event which then opens the way for our restoration to heaven. So that is the probably typical way of framing the salvation story. That's the way we tell it, the way we think about it, i.e. creation, fall, redemption, and then hope of heaven. Now, fundamentally, if you step back and look at it, you can tell this is a linear framework. It goes from left to right, and it sequences activities within a script, which we're familiar with as a narrative structure, i.e. one thing follows another. But it does something else. It actually suggests one thing causes another. And what this tends to do is it tends to say that the cross and salvation is a reaction to the fall. The unraveling is a reaction to the fall, and probably implies that the fall was somewhat unexpected in the initial creation. The danger in this framing is that we start to see God's will and God's actions as reacting to a problem. And this implicitly makes our sin, the fall, the first cause of salvation, not the will of God as the first cause of salvation. And the extension of this linear thinking and its consequential assumptions is that the incarnation follows and reacts to the fall. So there are, however, severe limitations with what I call the problem-solving framework of thinking. Just forget theology for the moment. I'm just talking here about problem-solving as an architecture for thinking. Let me just sketch the problem-solving framework, which goes something like this. Here we are in a certain situation and there's an expected normality. Something, however, goes wrong. We call that a problem. And a problem is some deviation from the expected normality. In normal problem solving, you would try to define that problem, and that problem has symptoms. Your job is to try to get behind the symptoms with a cause and effect analysis. I'm drawing here a fishbone diagram, which is one of the many cause and effect diagrams that came out of the business improvement management school called Total Quality Management. And as we diagnose the causes, in turn, we can then think of solutions to eradicate those causes, which if we then implement the solutions, we will then get back to our goal, which is the restoration of normalcy. So that is the traditional problem-solving approach, and you will find in most so-called critical thinking curricula, that's really what it comes down to. It's in fact an analytic, diagnostic, a pulling apart of problem solution. Now, what's limited about that? And I claim it's extremely limited. Useful, but limited. So, what's limited about it? Number one, it is not creative. There is nothing fundamentally new in this picture. It's all deductive. In other words, it starts from a general proposition, which is the problem, and then it deduces from that downstream solutions to that problem. What this means is that the solutions actually only reflect the problem. They're framed by the problem. That's problem number one. Problem number two is really significant, and that is that it is a negatively framed picture of thinking. We start to define everything as derived from a problem. And this obviously casts a fairly pessimistic, dark shadow over our thinking. Look, examples of this abound, and I've already mentioned the safety world. That's a very, very common area where this cause and effect analysis to try to find the root causes of problems occurs. The third limitation is that it's actually not very ambitious. Because if you think about it, all it's aspiring to do is to get back to the status quo and restore the status quo. It's as if that's our whole effort in life. A very limited view of perfection. I could give you so many examples of how limited this is in practice. It's useful, but limited. And I actually think there are enormous parallels here as to how we limit the gospel in similar ways if we start to think of the gospel in sin-based terms. You can see that left to right flow I've got there is very similar to the narrative flow of redemption that the other sketch I drew. We simply, with this way of thinking, won't get into the enormity of the creation project that Scripture tells us God has in mind. And that's the kind of reductionist thinking that Gregory's trying to break out of. But before we get back into the world of theology, let's just keep going with how we actually think. And my claim, and I've built my professional life on this claim, is that problem solving is not exclusively how we think, and it's certainly not how we think at our best. In a word, we humans are dream machines first and problem solvers second. Now, cognitively, this is very hard to pin down. Some people have called this process abduction. It's a term that the famous empirical philosopher Charles Peirce coined at the beginning of the 20th century. He said, abduction is the process of forming explanatory hypotheses. It is the only logical operation which introduces any new idea. Sometimes he called it a leap of faith. Others simply have called it the imagination, the faculty of imagination. Of course, Coleridge most famously developed that picture of the imagination. But what I can say is this. I can attest to one thing from my experience, from reading philosophy, but also my experience with human systems, is that the closer you get to trying to pin down and explain empirically exactly how a new idea is generated, the harder it is and the more we fail to do it, because we seem to be approaching mystery. However, and this is a really significant point, it's not a mystery from our experience when we do it. It's a mystery on how we might codify it into any kind of formula. It seems to resist codification. It doesn't resist experience, I would claim. We live by it. Now, because of this, cognitive science lags way behind being able to explain and codify this. And there's a reason for that. That is, cognitive science confines thinking largely to the realm of information processing. So as a result of that very narrow framing, cognitive science does a really poor job of being able to explain the creative process. But it's there. The creative process is there in our experience. So let me tell you a story to illustrate how real this is. The story is not from my business consulting experience, but my first career as a teacher, school teacher. As a young teacher, I worked at one of the large private schools in Australia called Barker College. And after a couple of years, the headmaster approached me and asked me if I would take on the job of coaching the track and field team, the athletics team. And I was really reluctant to do it for a simple reason, which is that they were perennial losers. As a matter of fact, the last time the school had won the inter-school competition was roughly 50 years prior to that time, to that conversation taking place. And nonetheless, I took it on. But when I took it on, I didn't take on a, as it were, quote-unquote, problem-solving task. I didn't take on a task where I said, it's my job to arrange training sessions, it's my job to get kids to volunteer, it's my job to get kids to turn up on Saturday, it's my job to get all the equipment there. I didn't have that, what I'd call, administrative or managerial conception of the task. From the word go, in my heart, it was framed as a dream. And the dream was that one day we would win this jolly thing. One day, and let me tell you, from where I stood, it was impossible. There was no cause and effect analysis that would lead you to any such conclusion. There wasn't the culture, there wasn't the history. We were so poor compared to two other very champion schools that I thought it just looked like a Mount Everest. However, that dream, which I shared then with a young colleague who was younger than me called Ian, we held that dream together. And the point about a dream, you've got to take it seriously. And that meant articulating it. So I told stories in front of assemblies of 500 kids or 600 kids or 1,000 kids about what great winners, people who lifted themselves up up from failure and became champions out of nowhere. And that dream was not only had to be articulated, but that began to frame very different activities we did that we would not have done if we were just taking a problem-solving managerial approach to it. For instance, the school had no culture of winning, and it didn't prize the past as a result. So they didn't even have records, school records. Ian and I tediously went through all the results we could find to retrospectively create a school record book. Who was the fastest ever Barker athlete in the under 1400 metres? And we created this. It's one of many things we did to think back from the dream into the current reality. Now that dream, when we had it, didn't exist. It did not exist, but it existed in our minds, and it began to shape reality. The story taught me a lot, because I kept saying we're going to win this thing in 5 years. Well, 5 years clocked by and we were not looking like winning it. We'd improved, but we hadn't looked like winning it. Then after the 9th year since I took it over, I made the decision to leave teaching and go into consulting. And one of the things that held me back was I knew we were going to win it in the next year, because we'd come second 2 years in a row. Sure enough, in the 10th year, we won. I was actually out there, although I'd left the school, in the stands with 10,000 people. Halfway through the afternoon, I can so clearly remember this, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the scores went up. Barker was so far ahead, they were uncatchable. I just stood up, put my hands in the air, and my mate Ian in the middle of the track saw me and put his hands in the air, and 2 guys out of 10,000 joined spirits and said, "We have done it." Now, what happened was very instructive to me. By the end of the afternoon, I'd always dreamed, when I'd imagined what was going to happen on the final event that we won, that we just win. What happened was the school won that afternoon with the highest score ever recorded in the century-long tradition of that inter-school carnival. And furthermore, it started a dynasty. The school became literally the strongest track and field school in the Southern Hemisphere, boys' school in the Southern Hemisphere. I had never imagined that. That taught me a lot, because after the 5th year, when we weren't winning, I began to doubt myself. I began to say, am I actually irresponsible to talk about this dream? Because I can't guarantee it. I'm a human being. I can't guarantee it. What, however, changed my thinking was this: well, no, I can't. But I can guarantee this. If I don't have the dream, and if I don't articulate the dream, then there is zero chance of it happening. We're not going to drift into it. But if I articulate the dream, I've certainly brought it into the realm of, let's say, 50-50 possibility. That's how I consoled myself. So that story really framed a lot of my life. Now, I think every human being shares in this dream machine capability. In fact, it's what defines us. Some people for sure invest more time and effort in it, more faith in it than others, and some people are better at it than others. But I would also argue that the highest of our achievements are when we align our choices and actions with the dream machine rather than the problem solver in us. Dreams shape and reshape reality. Problem solving, at best, can restore the status quo. However, people need help to do this. And so when I got into consulting, I constructed a grammar for dreams, as it were, because the future doesn't exist, so it's very shadowy and hard to express. And this was to help leaders who were doing with their organisation somewhat what I was doing with the Barker athletics team, which was, how do I create an alternative future to the one that I've got here? The architecture I created in Second Road is called the ABCD architecture, and I've certainly mentioned it before in gospel conversations, but I'll go through it again because it's simple but profound. So it says that what we have in life, if you're a group of leaders who are running an organisation, we are on what we call the river of life. Meaning there's a kind of a tidal flow to life and a tidal flow to an organisation that by which what a lot of people do in business is they try and predict the future. And all that is some like future analysis using trends and one thing and another. And we say, well, that actually doesn't work. So the structure of a dream or an argument, which we invented, works this way. We say that we begin, ironically, in what we call the A space, which is the current situation. We don't look at the current situation the way most people do, but as latent possibility. But that's where you begin your thoughts, the current situation. You then don't go into solutions. You actually go to what we call the B space, and you can see that, by the way, what we gave people here was like an algebra. We just gave them 4 letters of the alphabet. We didn't give them abstract words like goals and plans and strategies and analytics. We didn't give them any of those words. We gave them a framework that was deliberately, linguistically geometrical. And part of the geometry is this vision, the B, which is the future. Now, the future was framed by 2 things. It was framed firstly by imagination, which is the human capacity to think of something that doesn't exist. And the second thing it was framed by was desire. I would be just as happy, or probably even happy to say love. It's got to be a future that you not just imagine, but that you love. From that, you then work backwards into what we call the C space. This is where your activities and plans and ideas come from as to how you might get there, and then you go ahead in the D space to implement them. And that is how we got leaders to reshape reality, not by problem solving, by lifting them out and above that into a structured way of dreaming. Not just dreaming, but dreaming that was going to shape activities, choices, and realities. When we did this with people, a lot of them would say, how can we guarantee, just what I did with the Barker Athletics team, but how can I guarantee that B? What if it's wrong, etc., etc. But what we found was that once just like I did in the athletics team, people could articulate that, the more it had a habit of coming true, or at least very much reshaping the trajectory of the organisation. Now, importantly, to come back to where we began, the B in this doesn't exist when you articulate it. It doesn't exist in reality, but it does exist in the heart and the mind of the leaders. It's not a picture of the current situation, but it's a picture of the idea, the dream, that is going to shape the current situation. And that is what Gregory said God did, as it were. Gregory is saying, Genesis 1 and 2 is a B. God, first of all, had the idea out of which history would come. And as I said, that idea is framed by love. And it's not a prediction. So you can really see how we can say that when Gregory said God created the end, it's the end God would love that then shaped backwards into all of history. Let me just finish by saying, importantly, an important word about the end. We often used a biblical word to describe this B space, and the word was telos. Now, telos, as you would know, is a interesting Greek word that is often translated just as the end, but that the word end can have 2 beginnings. It can mean, at its simplest form, the finish. Now, that's actually obviously structuring that word in the sequential problem solving thing. First thing happens, second thing happens, and at the end, the last thing happens. It's a time-based goal. But the other meaning is very different. It means flourishing or flowering. It's the consummation of a hope and a possibility. If you'd have asked the teachers before me who coached the athletic team, what the end was, they would have said, well, the goal is to get to August, having improved, no kid being injured, relatively happy parents, etc., something like that. But that was never the end for me. The end for me wasn't time-based. It was some indefinable time in the future where we would stand on top of a mountain and say, we did it, we climbed this mountain. And if you start from here, you will end up doing very different things if you start from there. So the word telos is a really rich word. Importantly, what that does, what the B does, is it actually changes how you define the A. You don't actually define the A anymore as problematic. You define it as promising. That was a huge change we made, that you began to see latent possibility in the situation rather than problems. I call it trampolining the present situation. You begin to see the action potential in the present. But of course, when you express it, the B hasn't happened. It's a vision, it's a dream, but it will determine and shape reality. So I'm arguing that when we do this, we are participating in the divine creative process, that this faculty of imagination, although we can't break it down, it's extremely real. We are touching eternity when we do this. And we're participating in the divine mind, the flow of the divine mind. I actually say we are playing God. So we began by saying, it seems really counterintuitive what Gregory of Nyssa says, that God created the end first and the end shaped the beginning. But I'm saying, well, that's what we do. We do, now, of course, we do it in a shrunken way. I couldn't, I'm human and my dreams might or might not come true. But nonetheless, the actual faculty in its nascent qualities are there. We create the end before the beginning. Furthermore, that's us at our best. And that end then shapes retrospectively all the supposed beginnings that are going to contribute to that end. Now, what this does when we do it as humans, we are now lifted above a world of cause and effect into a world of love. We start to have to shape our actions from what we would love. And that enables us to play God and initiate new realities. So when David said, apparently strangely, that this is how God worked and how Gregory saw God working in Genesis, that Genesis was a vision through to the end of all things. What seemed strange at first, in fact, is something we all participate in with our experience. We conceive the end before we begin our actions, and then we work backwards from that end to create new beginnings.
We hope you enjoyed this piece by Gospel Conversations. For more information, please head to www.gospelconversations.com. Thank you and God bless.